This is the second lesson in the JavaScript unit, and in particular we'll be looking at programming inputs and outputs. So what we're going to do is remember how to write a simple JavaScript function on a web page, and then we're going to understand how to program input and output forms to allow user inputs to be manipulated by the JavaScript. So now let's analyze some code that will create a simple web page with a bit of JavaScript on it in our IDE. So what we have here is a bit of HTML that will allow us to create a button with the word submit on it, and when we click it, it will try and find a function called run, a JavaScript function called run. Now up here between our script tags we've got some JavaScript. We have a function that we have called run, and if we take a look inside this function, what it will do is it will create two variables, so two memory locations, one which is going to contain the number 5 and the other called number 2 which is going to contain the number 6. And what will happen when we press the button and run this function, when those two variables have been created, we've then finally got a little alert function to create an alert box which will add the contents of both of those variables together and display it on the screen for us. So if I were to submit, you can see that 11 has been worked out, has been calculated inside that alert box. So 5 and 6 have been added together, the contents of both of those variables, and 11 has been presented. Now that's fine, but one of the issues that we've got with this current setup, this current program, is that every single time we press that submit button, it's always going to add the same numbers together because we've hard coded them in our function. Now what would be better is if we could create some input forms so that the user could enter a number or a couple of numbers, and then the program could perhaps add those numbers together, a little bit like a user-friendly calculator. So let's have a look to see how we could develop this code to produce the desired result. Okay, so the first thing I could do is I could add a bit of code, another input. This time the type is number, so it's an input box. It's going to receive a number, and I'm going to give it an ID value called num1 so that we can identify that particular input form. So here you can see now that I've got an input form and I can enter a number. Now obviously before we hard coded two numbers and added them together, so it makes sense for me to perhaps duplicate that code, but what I would need to do is remember to change the ID of the second input form. So I could say number 1, I could then say number 2, and let's put a break in so that the button can be underneath, and let's run that code and see what we have. Let's also put a break to ensure that number 2 is underneath. Okay, so now I've got two input fields where I can input a number, input another number, and then press submit, which will run this particular function. Now at the moment it doesn't matter what numbers I put in, whether it's a 2 and a 3, if I press submit it will always produce the number 11 because that's what's hard coded in the function. Now what we want to do instead is we want to try and access the values that are in each of these fields. So to do that, what we can do is instead of saying that variable num1 is equal to 5, we could add in the following code. Document dot get element by ID. Now the first element that we want to access is num1, so I'm going to write that ID in the brackets. Then I'm going to go dot value, and I'm going to do a very similar thing to access the value that is put inside the field which has the ID num2. So what's happening here is that we are going to try and retrieve the number that has been put in the field with ID num1. We're going to retrieve the values that's been put into the field with ID num2. and then we're going to put those into the variables just like before, and then we're going to try and add them together. Actually, let's try and mix it up. Let's try and multiply these together. Okay, so let's put two numbers in that we want to multiply together. Let's put in a 5 and a 4, for example, and we'll press submit. And you can see that we have got 20 as our answer because 5 times 4 is 20. So here's an example of how you can actually have users enter values and then you retrieve those values that have been entered into the web page, and then you can manipulate them using JavaScript. Okay, just before we finish then, I just want to show you one other bit of code that I've made earlier, and what you can see here is there's nothing new. I've just added in an extra field, and I'm dealing not with numbers but with strings now, so just sort of text, characters on a keyboard. And what we've got is we've got a field which is going to receive a first name. We've got another field that's going to receive a surname, and we've got another field here that is going to receive a job. Now, when each of these three fields receives some data, we can press the button and it's going to run a function called run. Now up here in our script tags, we've got a function called run, and you can see that just like in our previous example, the first line of code here is going to try and find an element called with the ID first name, which is what this field is here, okay, this first name field, and it's going to try and get the value out of it. So whatever I type in to that particular field in first name, it will try and retrieve that value, and it will put it in a variable called fname. It will do the same for the next field, which has the ID surname. It's going to take whatever value I type in into that field, and it's going to put that value into a variable called sname, and then it's going to finally try and retrieve whatever is put into the final field, which has the ID of job, and it's going to put that into a variable called job. And then what I've done is I've just simply joined together some strings, okay, along with the contents of each of the variables. So in the alert box, it's going to present once there was a person called, and then it's going to take whatever the value is inside fname. It's going to join it with a bit of a space. It's then going to take the value of whatever's in sname, and it's going to join it with, and all he wanted to be was a, and then it's going to join it finally with whatever's in the variable called job. So let's see what happens if I type in a few names and a job. So let's start off by saying, oh, it's one that I've done earlier, Bob Jones, dream job, a drummer. Okay, so let's press submit and see if this works. Okay, so it does. Once there was a person called Bob Jones and all he wanted to be was a drummer. So it's tried to retrieve, or it has actually succeeded in retrieving the values that are in each of these fields, and then it's popped it into an alert box along with some other text to form a sentence. So perhaps that's something that you could have a little play around and try to get working yourself.